we are going to start out with a new scene and just take a look at setting something up to show all the different groups and how the collisions work, kind of like we did in the last chapter, but just expanding upon it a little bit more is something a little more interesting. I'm going to start out by adding in a particle. We'll do HV emitter, and I'm just going to call this HV emitter 1, and I'm going to be creating more and just move that along, HV emitter underscore 2, and so on. And actually, one thing that will make this a little bit easier, I'm going to go ahead and cancel this and open up our effects browser, and I'm going to create a new group. And now we can see the previous groups that we had from the last chapter, so what I'm just going to do is close out Lightwave and open it back up. And now that I've reinitiated it, those groups that we had before will be gone. You can see that they've now disappeared. And I'm going to create a new group and just call this group underscore 1 and click OK. Add that HV emitter. And we can see that is directly connected to group 1. But now we do not have the name set correctly. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And if we go to property, we can see that that's not going to show up until we add the specific object. So we'll go ahead and add that in with group 1, and then we can add in from there the new objects to the other groups. So whether or not you want to use the effects browser or just the regular method of clicking on the object is really up to you, depending on how you want to name them. And we can always name them later, and one of the best ways to do that is using the schematic view. But I'm going to start out by raising up this emitter object a little bit higher into the scene. And now we just have that going throughout. I'm going to increase the lifetime to 500 frames. So we are full animation, and scene will be 500 frames. And under the particle tab, I'm going to increase our lifetime to 300 frames, which is actually a bit long for this effect. Be able to see it, and we just want to make sure we have enough in its entirety. And what I'm going to do is decrease our generator size on the Y to 0.1, and I'm going to take our particle limit from 1000 and bring that down to 1, because we're going to start with just one particle, and our birth rate at 100 should be fine, because we're still just going to have that one particle coming out, and it won't create any more after that. And now the next thing I want to do is just change our group to the default and add in gravity. And we're sticking with the default group because we want to affect every object in the scene that we're going to have, and we don't want this to be limited to specific groups. We have -1 set, and we're going to take a look and see how quick that is. And that does look like it'll be more than enough to demonstrate this effect. So we can leave all of our default settings for gravity and close that out. And now what I want to do is create a collision object. We're going to go back to group 1, add in a collision, and now change the type to a plane. Our mode is going to be erase, and we're going to use the erase method to limit the lifetime. We could also do this just by limiting the lifetime for each of our individual objects, but this way we can control the exact position of where we want the objects to disappear and the new ones to appear. And if we scrub through, we can see that once it hits the erase object, that particle will disappear. And I can go ahead and close this out. And next we're going to be creating a new group that we're going to call group 2. So group underscore 2, click OK, and we're adding in, this time, an HV emitter. And now this time we want our birth rate at 100, particle limit 1000 is going to be fine for the default. Change our lifetime to 300 frames, and it's also going to be affected by our gravity. And we're going to change our nozzle to parent emitter end. We can close this out and hit M and select our parent emitter, which is going to be HV emitter 1. Close that. And now if we watch the animation, we can see the new particles being created once the first one is removed. And we do want to modify the properties. So we're going to select the item, HV emitter 2, go to properties, and under the motion tab, create a bit of vibration. I'm going to start with 1 and see how that looks. And that looks like it's going to break up our particles in a fairly decent manner. We can zoom in a little bit closer, and we can only see really 3 particles being created. But that's going to be good enough to expand beyond this point. So now what we're going to do next is create another layer and another collision. So we can close out the properties, and we're still in group 2. And we're going to add in a new collision object. And we're going to do the same options we had before, a plane that erases. And we can go ahead and move that up. And then we're going to continue on, close out the properties, create a new group, and we're going to call this group 3. And click OK. And now I've created a new collision, it seems, or not quite yet. So what I'm going to do is with that group 3, add in another HV emitter, and we're going to call, or actually change the nozzle to parent emitter end. And I want to change the lifetime to 300. And go to our motion options, increase vibration to 1. And then we need to close out the properties, hit M on the keyboard, and our parent item is going to be HV emitter 2. So now we can continue on and see more particles being created. And just as it works through each of these collision objects. So now that we're in group 3, we're going to add another collision, and we're going to change the type to plane, erase, move that up, and then we can close that out. And we're going to erase our next set of particles. And now we want to create a new group that we'll call group 4. And we'll add in a new HV emitter, change the nozzle to parent emitter end, and just go through and do the same thing we were doing with the other ones. Motion, set vibration to 1. We can close this out. M on the keyboard, parent item, HV emitter 3. I'm also going to adjust the properties of this new emitter a little bit higher for our birth rate. We'll go to 150, and our particle limit we're going to set to 10,000. And now as we move through, we can see the new sets of particles being created. So what I'm going to do is continue along with this and create a couple of more sets of collisions and emitters, and we can really see the kind of effect we're getting from these different particles, because we can create some really neat variations. And of course, every time we're doing this, we're creating a new emitter that we can change for HV options if we wanted to change over time. So I'm going to go ahead and just continue along doing what I was doing, creating new groups and bringing them down, and we can take a look at the scene once we have a couple of more sets of these objects in the scene. And now I've gone ahead and continued along what we were working on, and I've calculated the effect, and we can take a look as we move along through all of the different collision objects and creating new emitters as we move along. And we can see that we're generating new particles every single time, and every time each one of those particles breaks up, it creates even more. And it's just a really neat effect to expand upon what we're starting with. And you just started with that one particle, which breaks up into about 3, and that breaks up even more, and then we could just continue along and create some really interesting looking effects in that method and in that manner. And I've also gone ahead and reduced some of the birth rates throughout the area and throughout the scene, and that way we don't have too many particles being created. So at the end, we don't have an extremely large amount of particles being created. If I select our last emitter object, we can take a look and see the birth rate is 25. I'm going to go ahead and increase that to 50 and recalculate so we can break up that last object even more. And if we just take a look, we can really see that showing up. And since we're working with hypervoxels objects, we can apply a new hypervoxel to each one of these emitters. So as it passes through each one of these collisions, we have the ability to change its hypervoxel effect. Or we could just copy and paste onto all of them. And if we were working with a particle, then we would have a different surface for each one of these emitters. And that way we could change its color every time it hits a collision. And that's just one way we could achieve that effect. Now another thing we could do, since each one of these emitters is in its own group, we can also apply different wind effects and gravity effects for each of these different layers and sections of our animation. So one thing I'm going to do is just separate each one of these collision objects and make them a little bit farther apart from each other. And then we can start adding in the wind and have a different wind effector, an option for each of the different groups. So first I'm going to just move up our first emitter, and since everything is basically parented within the hierarchy to that first emitter, everything else is going to go with it. And I'm just going to move up each one of these collision objects and space it out a little bit more so we have some more time for these particles to separate and create some different effects as they're falling. And now if I calculate this, we'll be able to see a little bit more of what's going on, and then we'll be able to apply wind effects that we'll see a little more obviously. Okay, so what I want to do first is open up the effects browser. We can select group 1, which is going to be our first emitter, and I'm going to add in a wind object. And what I want to do is just position this wind object within that first area, and I'm going to increase its radius to 1.5. And actually what I can do is just increase that to 2, and since it's only really going to affect up to that collision object, it's not really going to matter too much. And this first wind mode, I'm going to make turbulence. And now we can see our first particle is just going to move around a little bit. I'll increase the power so we can see that a little bit more, up to 250. And we'll have it kind of fluttering. I'm going to close out our effects browser just for right now, open up the object properties, select our wind, and we just want to verify that we're in group 1 for both of them. Our first wind object, and now we're going to go on and create another wind object. So I can select wind to create a new wind object, wind_2, click OK, change this group to group 2, adjust our radius to 2 meters, and this time we're going to use vortex, and I'm going to move that up to our second section. And we'll see those second set of particles affected by the vortex. And I'm going to continue from there, creating another wind object that I'm going to call 3. Radius of 2 meters. Put it in group 3. Move that up to our third section. And now we can add in, let's do cylinder explosion. And that might be a little bit too much for that. So we can do random and just kind of move those particles around. Maybe we'll stick to something a little less. And we just want to make sure the effect is showing up. And that looks like it should work. So I'm going to go ahead and continue this, just as I did with our collision objects, and add more and more wind options so we can see the overall effects between our different groups and different objects. And now I've just set this up for 7 different groups, but we're going to take a look at the progression of our particles throughout the different wind options, and we can just see those being affected by different types of wind as they move down into the lower areas. And we can see once we hit that cylinder, and what I have is a rotation on the Y, just moving around. We don't have as much force moving it down, so it takes a little longer to get into our other frames. But then once we get to that second area, we have it on vortex, and we can see a little bit of motion there. And what I'm going to do is just increase our frames to 700 and recalculate this just so we can see its progression a little bit further throughout the animation. And you will really need to calculate this sort of an effect once we get this complex, because the overall scene is not really going to show up without calculating, because there are so many changes going on with the different wind. But now we can see a little bit further in the animation that nice rotation going into the next wind object. And we can really break it up with all the different groups. So starting with one little point and moving to all these different sections. And we end up with a really neat looking effect. So if I wanted to create a little bit of an animation with our camera, go ahead and select our camera, move it up to the top so we can see that one point, and then go all the way down to the end of the animation where we can see our other objects and just kind of zoom out. And we end up with a pretty neat looking effect. I'll go ahead and make this come down just a little bit more. I'm going to hit play, and we can just watch this little particle break up and go through all the different wind effectors and wind options that we have to create a nice variation in all of these different effects. And of course we can always expand upon this too and add a lot more different types of gravity, have it change back and forth, add in collision objects, but overall it's a really neat looking complex scene. And it shows you the overall changes that we can make with these particles very simply, and not have to worry about going into too much preparation for it. And like I said, we could add other collision objects to have them bouncing off each other, so there's a lot we can do with it. And now we're going to take a look at a couple of other generation techniques that we can make for these particles over time. So I'm going to clear our scene out, and we're going to start with a new one, and we're going to take a look at different types of birth rates to create different effects, and also textures that we can use to generate particles in specific patterns. So we're going to go up to File, and clear our scene. And I'm going to start out by adding in a particle object We're going to use the particle emitter, which is the partigon emitter, and we can just call that the default emitter, which will work just fine. And now we're going to take a look at working with different types of birth rates. First, I want to just change our scene a little. We're going to do 300 frames for our timeline. Make sure that our particles last for 300 frames. And under motion, I want to add explosion to this. So I'm going to type in a value of 2 and also go to our resistance and completely remove the resistance. So as we scrub through our animation, we will see all of these particles being generated over time. Now, if we wanted to have an effect with more of an instant type explosion, more particles all coming out at once, of course there's a couple of ways we could do that. We could generate by frame. So basically all of our different particles are all coming out with one frame, and we can see that expanding. What I am going to do really quick is decrease our generator size to 0.2, which is going to be 200 millimeters. And we can take a look and see that instant burst of particles just kind of come out. And then we could always set that fixed amount. So let's say we want that to happen at frame 30. So we move to frame 30, and then everything kind of bursts out. And that's one way we could do it. I'm going to increase our particle limit just a little, so we can put more particles in the scene. And we're still generating by frame, but once we have more particles in our scene, we can see that they are continuously being generated, and what we have is 100 particles approximately being generated per frame. We change that to second, and now we have 100 particles approximately being generated per second. Now, let's say I wanted to have all of these particles being generated at once and still use that over the second. So instead of maybe having them all created at one frame, let's say over the course of 1 second we want all of our particles to come out as part of our explosion and then no more to continue. Well, what we need to do is figure out how many particles we would like and then go from there. So let's start out and let's have 1500 particles. And that means our particle limit is also going to need to be 1500 because of course we want it to stop. So if we set our particle limit to 1500, now over the course of 1 second it's going to generate all 1500 of our particles. Now let's say we wanted to generate a little bit quicker than that. We don't want it all coming out in one frame, but let's say we wanted it to come out in 15 frames. Well, since our particle limit is 1500, and right now our birth rate is 1500, over the course of 1 second, what we can do is double the amount of our birth rate and generate the particles twice as fast. So if I increase our birth rate to 3000, it is now going to generate all of our particles within 15 frames, and then stop after that. So now we can see instead of going over the course of 1 second, once we hit 15 frames, no more are being created. So that's a really cool way to control explosion bursts that we could have. We can increase the amount even more, bringing it up to 6000, which is going to make it go around 7 frames. So over the course of 7 frames it will generate, and after that it will stop generating and just propel the current particles outward, unless we increase our particle limit. If we increase our particle limit to 3000, it is now going to create 3000 particles over the course of 15 frames, because our birth rate is set to double the particle limit. Bring that down to 3000 for our birth rate, and over the course of 30 frames now, we can generate that amount. We can also go the other direction with this. If I wanted these 3000 particles to be generated over 2 seconds, or 60 frames, I can reduce the birth rate down to 1500. And also keep in mind, this is while working with 30 frames per second. If you need to work with 24 frames or 25 frames per second, then you'll need to make adjustments depending on that frame amount. But now we can see over the course of 60 frames, or 2 seconds, we are generating all of our particles and creating a quick little explosion where they stop after it reaches its limit, which is pretty cool. Let's also take a look at using a texture for this. In other words, we can generate and remove certain areas where we'd like our particles to not be generated. We can easily do this by creating a texture for our object. I am going to increase our generator size up to 0.5 on all of our axes. And I want to increase our birth rate. Or actually, let's just increase our particle limit up to 6,000. If we can take a look, we can see how consistent it is throughout the sphere of our nozzle. Let's change this to a texture. Open up our texture, and now what we can do is customize, whether with an image, or a procedural, or a gradient, exactly where these particles are going to be generated. So let's start out by using a procedural texture, just with our default right now, and scrubbing through the animation, and there's really not too much we can see. So I do want to increase our contrast to remove those areas and try to make it a little more obvious. And we can see some of the areas have broken up. If we take a look at the overall size of our grid, we can see it as 1 meter, and our effect is at 1 meter. So I'm going to reduce the size of this procedural down to 0.5 on all of our axes. And that's going to break it up a little bit more. Maybe we'll go ahead and double that to 2 meters and make larger gaps. And now we can see that texture a little bit better, where we have a lot more being generated on the left than on the right. Bring that up to 3 meters, and now that space and that negative area has been increased even more. And we have more variation in our generator. So that's kind of a neat little thing we can do, is using these different textures. I could set this to underwater, which is going to create an animated effect of the generator, which means our particles will move around a little bit more. We could set this to any number of these. We could do crust. And what I could also do is invert our layer so that we're just generating, at this point, from the available holes that are open. I'm going to reduce the size down to 1 meter. And now we can see we're just generating from what's going to be the black areas and just kind of spraying out the side. If I turn off the invert layer, it's going to remove the white areas and not generate in that specific part. We could change this to the crumple and do a little bit more with it. We could use brick and get some different shapes. And now we're just coming out of the cracks of our bricks. We invert that, we're going to come out in the opposite. So there's a lot we can do with these different texture effects. I could also change this to a gradient. And we can work with these gradients for distances to the camera and the object, add little bits of variation, and also use image maps to control with white and black values of where we want to generate our particles and where we don't. So there's a lot we can control for the shape of our nozzle without just using the default box or sphere. And then of course we can also use objects. In the next section we're going to take a look at using objects as emitters and also collision objects.